All right, guys, I just gotta say before we start this video, there is this random dove that keeps landing on the outside of my window and just staring at me with its one weird bird eye turned toward me. And I'm gonna be honest, it's freaking me out. But anyway, oh Lord, it's back. Uh, anyway, oh no, it brought friends. I'm just gonna ignore the birds that are now gathering outside my window, staring at me with their weird bird eyes. And we're going to move on and talk a little bit about what's been happening in the South. So, in our last video, we talked about how the North is becoming an industrial power, and it's really becoming bent on Christian reform movements. The South has developed in a slightly different way. The South has become much more entrenched in plantation agriculture, dependent upon labor of enslaved Africans. So, it's always helpful when we talk about slavery to remember exactly how many people we're actually talking about here. We often get this really skewed view of the South that is brought to us by movies like Gone with the Wind, books, where every white person in the South lived on a plantation and wore dresses like this if they were a woman, and they went to parties all the time. They had hundreds of slaves at their beck and call. And that's actually a really skewed view of the South because we know from the 1860 census that 76% of Southerners owned no slaves at all. So 76% of white people living in the South did not live on plantations and did not own slaves at all. Of the remaining percentage, most of those people also did not live on plantations. They owned between 1 and 9 slaves, and they lived on small subsistence farms. When we start thinking about those people who are essentially Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind, we're talking about less than 1% of the South's entire population that is living on these vast plantations. But that tiny number of people, they actually control most of the wealth for the entire United States. So that tiny group of people that own these vast plantations with hundreds of slaves, those people control most of the wealth in the entire country. They're some of the richest people in the US at this point. And they've become rich off of trade and off of agriculture, particularly the growth of cotton. Cotton is king by the 19th century. But most Southerners don't live that lifestyle at all. One of the great turnarounds that we'll talk about when we talk about the Civil War is how this tiny group of people managed to convince 76% of the population that the institution of slavery is beneficial to them, enough that they will take up arms and fight an entire civil war over it. And that's not something that happens overnight. That's something we'll discuss in our Civil War videos with the Unit 5. But the South is going to be relying at this point on cotton agriculture. Now, there are other things being grown in the South. Tobacco is still being grown in some areas. Rice is still being grown in the Low Country and will continue to be grown in the Low Country for a long time. And when I say Low Country, I'm talking about the areas around Charleston and Savannah. That is the American Low Country. But cotton is going to be the greatest producer. Cotton has become king mostly because of Eli Whitney's refining the cotton gin and making it user friendly. And so that allows cotton to suddenly become a profitable crop. It's easy to clean now. And so that suddenly makes it much easier and much cheaper for people to produce. So certainly most slaves in the South are going to be in cotton production. Now, the South is going to allow for the cessation of the Atlantic slave trade. So America actually stops slaves from coming in to the United States from Africa in 1808. And so what happens after that is an internal trade that develops. So for much of the 19th century, we're not talking about slaves coming in from Africa. The African American people who are enslaved in the South are at this point, most of them have been born in America, and so have many of their parents. So we're talking about an internal trade at this point, people selling people to different plantations in different states around them. The plantations of the South grow up with very vibrant folk cultures. Slaves develop beautiful and vibrant cultures of their own as a means of resisting the dehumanizing elements of this institution. Um, but this institution is going to become more dehumanizing the closer we get to the Civil War. So The South is going to have a very visceral reaction to things like the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement, again, posits the idea that the owning of slaves is actually a moral evil. It's something morally wrong. It's a sin. Now, Southerners are also Christians, predominantly Protestant Christians at this point, and they don't see this as a sin. Early on, they had combated people who spoke out against slavery as, yeah, we know it's incompatible with the ideas of liberty in America. We acknowledge that, but slavery is a necessary evil. We need these slaves to rebuild our economies after the revolution. But once money can be made through cotton production, through the changes with the cotton gin, suddenly is no longer a necessary evil. Southerners begin to view it as a positive good, that this is a positive force. And so early on, slave owners will meet this argument that slavery is a sin with a concept that rolls out from a Protestant minister here in Georgia, who will argue for what he calls the concept of the Christian slaveholder. The Christian slaveholder has a duty to Christianize his slaves. And so Christian slaveholders would argue that slavery is a positive institution because it is exposing people to Christianity, and that a Christian slaveholder does not mistreat their slaves. They don't sell families apart from each other. They don't whip their slaves. They don't punish them. They love their slaves. They care for their slaves as though they are their children. None of this is true. None of it is true. But it's what slaveholders put out there to combat this idea that slavery is a moral evil. They strike back with, how can it be an evil if we're converting these people to Christianity? This is good. This is a good thing. How could any Christian argue that something that converts a person is a bad thing? The North still successfully argues that, holding people in slavery and forcing them to convert to your religion is probably still a bad thing. Just putting that out there. So as this goes on and the North begins to agitate more for anti-slavery, we're going to start to see groups who are actively helping slaves escape from the South. And that's when we're going to start to see the South begin to codify more laws that restrict the rights of enslaved people and also of non-enslaved people. So we start to see criminalization of things like teaching a slave to read and write. It's not illegal for a slave to know how to read and write. Many slaves in the South do know how to read and write. In fact, many slave owners would see that as somewhat of a useful tool to have a slave that was literate. But they make it illegal to teach a slave to read or write. Because they don't want too many people out there reading, because if they're reading, they can pick up these abolitionist tracts and start getting ideas about being free. We're going to start seeing restrictions that restrict the movement of enslaved people. Traditionally, before this period, when they weren't working, enslaved people tended to move around between the plantations in a walkable area quite freely. There's not a lot of restriction on that movement, and many people have family members that are on nearby plantations, or even be married to someone and have children on a nearby plantation. And so the movement of people around in that early on isn't so much of an issue. In fact, slave communities are often made up of multiple plantations in a walkable area. There's a delightful book by a man named James Blassingame called The Slave Community that really talks about this if you're curious to know more. But as we start to see abolitionists enticing slaves to escape on the Underground Railroad, we're going to start to see people kind of cracking down on the free movement of enslaved people. We're also going to start to see the South's commitment to slavery begin to influence the politics of America. In fact, from 1820 until 1860, the South's dedication to slavery is going to be a major issue in American politics. And almost every argument that comes up is going to, in some way, relate back to slavery and what its future is going to be in this country. And we'll explore those in our next series of videos on the sectional crisis and the Civil War.